Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those in the West Coast. Both of our guests today are actually in the West Coast. It's morning for them. Welcome, Ambassador Pifer, and welcome, Catherine, Professor Stoner from Stanford University. Our event title today is Can the Western Policy Help Ukraine Achieve Victory? In light of most recent developments and the US high-level visits to Ukraine, and then Europeans mobilizing. I think there was an announcement of additional aid package today from the European side as well. There's a lot of support to Ukraine, both militarily and economically, on the humanitarian side as well. We're going to talk about this broad picture and how these aid packages and Western efforts can facilitate some sort of victory for Ukraine. Of course, we're going to discuss what that victory could look like and what it means. Today, I'm joined by two great experts, preeminent scholars in their fields. They don't need long introductions. Stephen Pifer is a former ambassador to Ukraine. He is with the Brookings Institution, and Dr. Stoner, Catherine Stoner, is senior fellow with Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. These are just one of the hats that they each are wearing these days. So we thank them very much for joining us, because they're the top experts in their fields. And I will go ahead and start with Ambassador Pifer. I will be asking him for an assessment of US policy in his introductory remarks, and how the US is leading the Western effort. And then I will go to Dr. Stoner for hopefully getting the perspective of the Russians on the ongoing conflict. And then I'll contribute on the Turkish side, and then we'll take the conversation from there. Again, welcome both of you. Ambassador Pifer, please, floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kadir. Let me just give maybe a 5-minute overview of US policy, beginning with where the policy was shaping up back in December, well before the war started. But I think at that point, US intelligence already had some pretty significant signs that the Russians were going to invade. And so the focus that you saw in December was trying to dissuade the Kremlin from launching a war. And so there were efforts to try to offer what we call diplomatic off-ramps. So you saw in January, both the United States and NATO offered negotiations on things like arms control and risk reduction measures that could have contributed to European security, but the Russians weren't interested. At the same time, beginning in early December, Washington began saying if the Russians invade, there are going to be 3 sets of costs. One will be sanctions that go way beyond what the Russians have been hit with to date. 2 would be increased flows of weapons going to the Ukrainians to help them better defend themselves. And 3rd would be a greater NATO military presence on its eastern flank. And actually, I think correctly, the United States and Europe did not wait for the Russian invasion to begin the 2nd and 3rd items. So you already saw at the end of January increased flows of weapons, particularly from the United States, Britain, and Poland to the Ukrainians. And you also saw the United States, France, Germany, Britain moving some forces into Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, to both assure those countries, but also make clear to the Russians that NATO territory was off limits. Now, in the end, US policy, Western policy failed to deter the Russian invasion. And I'll defer to Catherine on this. I'm not sure if Putin was deterrable on this question. So what you've seen since then is US policy basically looking for ways to support Ukraine and impose greater costs on Russia. And the way I see the objective, it's to facilitate a Ukrainian victory, which I think is, hard to achieve, but not impossible. And I define that as pushing the Russians back to the line as of February 23, or at a minimum, facilitating a negotiated settlement on terms that would be acceptable to Kyiv, that would meet its key interests. So what you've seen is a significant boost in arms flow going to Ukraine, $3 billion worth in the past 4 months. And initially it was things like javelins and stingers, which are relatively easy to use, and then facilitating the provision from other countries of S-300s and Soviet legacy weapons that the Ukrainians were familiar with. So it wouldn't require a lot of training. I think what you've seen in the last couple of weeks is the assessment in Washington is that this war could go on for a number of months. And so now what they're doing is they're providing more sophisticated weapons, things like artillery, kamikaze drones, armored personnel carriers that will require some training. So they are bringing Ukrainians out of Ukraine. They're training them as the equipment begins to flow in. And again, it takes a little bit more time to get those capabilities to the point where the Ukrainians can use them, but they are going to, I think, significantly enhance the ability of the Ukrainian military. And I expect that in the future, other types of weapons may be considered. The United States has been doing the diplomacy to lead the Western sanctions on Russia, and the conversations on this were already beginning in December, so they could be imposed fairly quickly. And my guess is that the sanctions were tougher than the Kremlin expected in really, I think, two cases. One was sanctions on the Russian central bank. Vladimir Putin had $630 billion in foreign reserves in the Russian central banks on February 1. The mistake was half of those were in Western financial institutions. That's now locked down and frozen. But also the ban on high-tech exports. So you're seeing lots of reports now of Russian factories closing. The mayor of Moscow says he expects to lose 200,000 jobs in the coming weeks. And I think there's some real economic pain coming to Russia as a result of these sanctions. But it probably is going to take some time to really hit home. You've also seen the U.S. move to bolster its presence on NATO's eastern flank. Roughly 10,000 troops have moved from the United States to either Germany or to Poland, mainly to Poland in the last 3 months. And again, that goal is to basically reassure Central and Eastern European members of NATO that NATO is there to defend them. And also, I think, to send a signal to Moscow that while the United States and NATO have made clear that they are not prepared to send their forces to fight for Ukraine, they very much are prepared to fight to defend NATO territory. And then you've seen political actions trying to isolate Moscow, actions at the United Nations. There's a debate going on now about the G20 meeting in 6 months' time. How do you handle that? I think a lot of Western leaders are not going to want to be there if Vladimir Putin is there. But I think also you've seen now, and I think Secretary Austin said the quiet part out loud, there is an effort now and a longer-term goal to weaken Russia. And it's not in terms of continuing this war beyond what the Ukrainians want. Quite frankly, if the Ukrainians reach a point where they want to end the war and they believe that's in their best interest, we should be supportive of that decision. But however this war ends, my sense is that the United States and many countries in Europe are going to look at Russia very much in the sense of an adversarial relationship. And it's hard for me, for example, to see a move by Washington, again, however this war ends in Ukraine, a move to anything that looks like normalization absent two conditions. And one would be Vladimir Putin's departure from the leadership, and then a successor who probably looks a lot like Vladimir Putin in background, but hopefully ends the war, or this could be several years down the road, but then make some political changes, some real changes that suggest that the Russia that we would be dealing with is not going to be the Russia we have today. And so I do think, for example, again, however the conflict ends, there's going to be a lot of sentiment in Washington to maintain some of the sanctions, particularly the sanctions on high-tech exports, which appear to be impacting more sophisticated Russian weapons. So again, we'll see how the war ends, but my guess is more broadly, we're in for a very long, cool period of relations between Washington and Moscow.
Thank you, Ambassador. Catherine, please go ahead and give us your assessment of what the Russians might be thinking, what Putin might be thinking. One question already Ambassador posed to you was whether this was deterrable in the first place at the beginning of the conflict. Please, thank you.
Sure. So I hope you don't mind if I share my screen. I just have a few slides that might be helpful to kind of situate our discussion. And I just want to point out that this is, of course, not, let me put it in this mode. that this isn't new, right? Where we are in 2022, and it's not new in 2014, as I'm showing you here on the screen. Really, we can take this back a very, very long time. Historically, Mr. Putin's perspective, and as he told us last summer in his kind of odd history or understanding of history of Ukraine, he is basically saying that Ukraine was part of Russia. It was accidentally given to Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev in a celebration of something. But it was never dreamt that Ukraine would not be part of the Soviet Union. And so this has all been a mistake. It's part of, I think, his legacy of gathering the lands, if you will, of what he sees as something called Novorossiya, or New Russia, and it's really old Russia. So this would include Ukraine, Belarus, possibly Moldova, which is here on our map on the outer edge of Ukraine, where there has been a sort of simmering, frozen conflict along this border. I don't know if you can see where my arrow is moving or not. You can, right? So, and this is called Transnistria, and Russia has troops here too. That's been going on since the 90s. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, of course, Russian speakers were left in the other in the other 14 republics of the Soviet Union, the 15th being Russia itself. So I speak English, but I don't want to, have England come and help me here in the United States or save me from something. And this is how the Ukrainian perspective, right, is that most of them don't want to be saved by Russia, even if they speak Russian. So. But Mr. Putin doesn't understand that. He doesn't see that there is a way for there to be some kind of personal agency on the part of Ukrainians. And so he thinks that their color revolutions, and there was one in Georgia, the Republic of Georgia in 2003, and then, of course, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, protesting a corrupted election. That election was overturned. There was a democratically elected president in free and fair elections in Mr. Yushchenko. He then lost in 2010 to Yanukovych, who was kind of an old communist-style leader. And ultimately, his ouster in February of 2014 prompted ostensibly Russia to seize Crimea. So I want to point out that this was done under Putin, and it isn't obvious that any other Russian leader would have behaved the same way. So you asked me to link this to my book, Kadir, and so the regime type matters. It matters that Putin is an authoritarian, and that it's been a hardening authoritarian system since 2014. Since his return to the Kremlin in 2012, in particular. He's been in office now, of course, for 22 years, and he could actually be in office until 2036 because he had some constitutional changes made in 2020 to allow that. So first, there's this uprising, this Orange Revolution, and Mr. Putin's worldview is that, again, people don't have personal agency. Those protesters in 2004 must have been put up to it by the CIA, and evidence of this is Victoria Nuland from the State Department handing out cookies to protesters at the time. Things like this, that they allege, the Russian side alleges happened in 2004. And then again, we have this uprising in 2014 because Yanukovych, who is then, as I mentioned, elected president in the fall of 2013, was to have signed a promise to accede or apply to the European Union as a member. And this is the problem. It's not NATO expansion, as Putin has said, that is a problem, because NATO has not expanded to Russian borders since 2004 with the Baltic republics. It's already there, right? Here we are in 2022. And in 2004, Ukraine was not about to join NATO. and in fact had been told someday they would, and Steve can talk more about that because he was involved there, and I know he has great insight into that. They were told that by the US in 2004, but as was Georgia, that someday they might join. But they were not about to join, and we can, I think, discuss that this may have been quite problematic. And the reason is the Europeans didn't want to provoke Russia. Well, it turns out it didn't matter. Russia was provoked anyway, even without NATO membership. And that's because I think the nature of the regime in Russia and the nature of the regime in Ukraine. And what we have in Ukraine, even though it was imperfect and a great deal of corruption there as well, has a thriving civil society, has an active parliament, has had democratically elected presidents. People have, there's the right to free speech, the right to an open and fair media there, and so not perfect in Ukraine, but certainly not the same conditions politically in Russia. And it is, therefore, an example potentially to Russians of what they could have. They could have Ukraine. They, and if Ukraine is made successful and prosperous and democratic, well, that's a threat to an authoritarian regime because Ukraine is a huge country. It's the largest country in Europe, if we don't count Russia as part of Europe, has 44 million people, and it matters. And so this is both, I think, this conflict, a result of the conflict in 2014, when you'll remember Crimea down here, the Crimean Peninsula, was seized and occupied because the president at the time, Yanukovych, faced this uprising, popular uprising against his decision to not sign the treaty that he had promised, or the papers that he had promised, to start the accession process to the European Union. People came out into Maidan Square in something called Euromaidan in November of 2013. That lasts through February 2014, when an agreement is negotiated with Yanukovych, and things seem to be settling. But the next thing we know, Yanukovych disappears, the president of Ukraine, pops up in Russia and says his life was under threat. And then these little green men appear in the Crimean Peninsula without insignia on their shoulders, and they turn out to be Russian speaking. And of course, it's the Russian military coming out of their bases, and they seize Crimea from a sovereign and independent Ukraine. And then for the last 8 years, with 14,000 lives lost on the in Ukraine, there has been a civil war, effectively, but it is a civil war that is supported by Russia. And the separatists here are armed by Russia. This dark spot is the area that on February 23rd, the day before the Russian invasion, was occupied by the separatists. But there has been active conflict here for the last 8 years. This is the entire Donbass area, these two provinces of Ukraine that Russia, is moving through now. And we could find an area of the conflict, but you've probably seen it. And here's the city of Mariupol here. So getting back, I guess, to, why does Putin want this? Well, he has invoked historical reasons, right? That Kyiv and Rus is where Prince Vladimir in 989 took on Russian Orthodoxy. So he has invoked that as a reason to do it, and that has proven very popular with the Russian people. But the real reason is this threat, and the way he sees from Ukraine turning to the West, and the way he sees the world is in terms of great powers, and so there is the West and there is Russia, and then there is China. Russia is a great power, according to Mr. Putin, and its rights must be respected, and its sovereignty, and it has a natural historical sphere of influence, and Ukraine is crucial to that. So having Ukraine be a different kind of political and economic example is a threat to his regime. And then, we can talk about the timing. I'll stop here as to why we think he did this now. That is in 2022, as opposed to having continued in 2014 and to occupy more of Ukraine, which is what they're trying to do here, where my arrow is. So let me stop there, Kadir, so we can maybe have more of a conversation and questions.
Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate those remarks, and I've taken away, I think, your answer to the question about Putin was this was probably not deterrable. And Ambassador Pifer, please, if you want to comment on that, that's fine. And what I wanted to ask you also is, you've described an evolution in U.S. policy from first, trying to negotiate a way out in the face of Russian threats, and then when that proved impossible, U.S. moved to basically policy of increasing costs, and then now we are in a stage where the United States wants to ensure that Russia can never do this again, regardless of what happens in Ukraine, by sort of, reducing Russian capabilities, etc. So this kind of evolution along the way, as you mentioned yourself, deterrence has been impossible, basically. At the beginning, Biden ruled out any kind of military response. Do you think that had an impact on this larger failure of deterrence? If he didn't do that, do you think we would still be here in a similar situation, given that Putin was probably going to do this one way or another? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I guess I'm not sure I would have advocated the administration saying it so many times that there would not be US or NATO forces fighting on Ukraine's behalf. But on the other hand, had the administration put that threat out there in an overt way, I'm not sure the Russians would have seen it as credible. And so I don't think it would have had an impact on this, given this in Vladimir Putin's mind, the asymmetry of interest that he sees in terms of, for him, as Catherine was saying, I think there's a big issue. It's not, I mean, NATO enlargement's a secondary question, but it's this, the danger that a democratic, thriving, Western-oriented Ukraine poses to, not to Russia, but to the Kremlin, because that's the kind of Ukraine that gets Russians to say, why can't we have that sort of democracy? The other thing, is I'm actually also at the end of the day not sure that if the United States and NATO went in to defend and we actually put boots on the ground, I'm not sure that actually is good for Ukraine in this sense, is that then changes the conflict in the eyes of the Kremlin. And it's not just a war with Ukraine, which to some extent, maybe the Kremlin may conclude it can walk away from that. But if it's a war against Ukraine, the United States, and NATO, I think it then perhaps becomes existential. I mean, that's the situation in which I would begin to fear, for example, the use of Russian tactical nuclear weapons against Ukrainian and NATO forces on Ukrainian territory. So I think that there's a line here that's probably worth preserving, but I am glad to see that the administration and other NATO, I mean, it's actually, I think there's now 35 countries around the world are providing either defensive assistance or weapons to Ukraine. And I think we should be doing everything that we can to give the Ukrainians what they need to defend themselves.
Thank you, Ambassador. Of course, my question was counterfactual, and in political science, whenever we ask that, right, it's always has to factor in some sort of degree of speculation. So thanks for that thoughtful answer. Nevertheless, I do want to come back to that military support and how it's being given to Ukraine. But before then, just go back to Dr. Stoner again. And when we discussed her book in our, past events, which I learned a lot, I highly recommend it to everyone. One of the things you discussed, the overarching point, I thought, Dr. Stoner, was that, Russia, don't underestimate Russia. Russia is able to use multiple sources of strength in a relatively efficient, smart way, and sort of disinformation campaigns, military capabilities, economic resources, energy. They are able to kind of use these, of course, nuclear capabilities. Russia is able to use these in a relatively effective way to carve itself a position of strength in the international arena, international system. Now, post-Ukraine war, not post yet, but we've seen a lot of capability issues, especially on the military front. Has your view changed, or have you adjusted that view, or is it still actually fitting into the picture you provided? Because I remember in your book, you're like, Russia is not necessarily great in any particular area or number one in any particular area, but a combination of this gives Russia a lot of status in the international system.
Yeah, well, not necessarily status, but influence, perhaps disproportionate influence relative to some of the conventional ways of measuring power, like size of a population or size of its military or how much it spends on military or the size of its GDP. So, so I think there are a couple of things about the military. First of all, I mean, we are supplying Ukraine with a lot of weaponry. That's great for Ukraine, but the Russian army is not just fighting the Ukrainian military here. They are kind of now, given what we're supplying, they're fighting in part against what we have, and we have the most powerful military in the world, in the United States, and obviously with NATO. The weakness of Russia, as the book ends in the final chapter, is the regime, right? And so that is the problem here. So the regime has a big, in Russia, under Putin. So Russia is not Putin. Putin is not Russia, although he tries to meld those things in our minds, right? So the regime here is incredibly corrupt, and that's also, what is noted in the book, and this is a weakness. And so is the military, right? The military is part of the regime. And so some of what we're seeing, what we saw initially with the military was, the corruption within, trying to sell off equipment, even in Belarus before they entered Ukraine. And then I think the real issue here is confirmation bias and intelligence failures. So you might remember in the Iraq War, George W. Bush went in to Iraq because the thought was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and he was assured by Don Rumsfeld and then Minister of Defense or Secretary of Defense here in the United States, and Dick Cheney, his vice president, that American tanks would be greeted by Iraqis with rose petals. So that turned out not to be right, if you remember. The Iraqis weren't as thrilled as we'd hoped. So here we are in a not dissimilar situation with Russia going into Ukraine. Remember, the way Putin sees the world, as I said earlier, is that the Ukrainian people have no individual agency or beliefs, right? And presumably he thinks this about everybody, including Russian people. They are manipulated, and they are being held hostage, basically, by the West and this corrupt government. And Zelensky happens to be president now, but he would have said the same about other elected presidents of Ukraine. But Zelensky, he particularly probably doesn't like. But and so what we will do is we will go in and liberate them, because the Ukrainian people will greet our tanks with bouquets of flowers. And instead, they were greeted with Molotov cocktails, right? Remember the civilians filling up those bottles with Molotov cocktails that we saw early on in the war. And he thought that Zelensky would flee Kyiv, and that they wouldn't need to worry about logistics beyond 2 or 3 days. And day 2, he was urging the Ukrainian military to join the Russian side. None of that happened. So it's, this again is a problem in an autocracy like his, where people don't want to bring him bad intelligence or something that might disconfirm what he wants to do anyway. And then there is, just as we had this problem of confirmation bias, there is a way to read the information in front of you to confirm what you want to do anyway. And so I think this is what happened, combined with corruption in the military, sending the B team initially especially around Kyiv. And now they have the equivalent of chief of the general staff taking over and more closely supervising the military efforts in the east, and although they're moving slowly, unfortunately, they're moving across territory. So hopefully, the weapons that we are sending will slow that. But the toll on Ukrainian soldiers and the Ukrainian military, I mean the Russian military, may eventually percolate to the population, and we start seeing signs of unhappiness with how long this is taking, because that was not supposed to happen. The length of time, this should have been over by now. That was clearly the plan initially.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, some of the Russian soldiers that were captured by the Ukrainians north of Kyiv, and this was their main thrust. I mean, I think their number one objective was to try to get Kyiv.
Right, initially,
said that they were sent into Ukraine with 3 days of rations.
Because it wasn't supposed to last longer than that.
Right. And then the Ukrainians also say, I mean, I haven't got confirmations, but they say that one of the convoys they destroyed, they found in one of the trucks boxes of dress uniforms, which they thought was for the victory parade. Right. So there's just been, I think, and this is actually a thing that surprises me. I mean, had you asked Catherine or me, or any Western expert on Ukraine, we would have said the Ukrainians are going to fight. I mean, I was in Kyiv January 30 and 31, and when you would talk to people not in the military, and say, what if the Russians invade? They would say, we're going to join the territorial defense forces. We're going to fight for our country. Now, what I did not predict was that the Ukrainians would be as effective in their defense as they have been, that they're doing so well. And I think at this point you can say, if you look at that original Russian invasion plan, which I think was designed to capture Kyiv very quickly and then occupy perhaps the eastern 2/3 of Ukraine, I think at this point, I mean, the Ukrainians have won in the senses that's beyond their capabilities now. And we'll see, I mean, it does look, as Catherine said, that they've reverted to a more traditional Russian offensive in Donbass, and they're now abiding by their doctrine. And we'll see what happens. Although the Ukrainians, I think, they're pretty dug in, and they're putting up, I think, a pretty stiff resistance. And there are a lot of people that say if the Russians don't, sort of succeed in 3 weeks or 4 weeks or so, at that point, they really become a spent force, and they really are not capable for a long time of conducting a major coherent offensive operation. So we'll see.
I would agree that time is not on their side, really, especially as, right now we're seeing allegedly high, majority of Russians appear to be supportive in the few polls that we've seen done of the special military action, which they are not legally allowed to call war, or they go to prison for up to 15 years and pay almost a month's salary fines if they don't. But they're facing inflation. The Russian economy is actually kind of surviving. They get $1 billion a day, or pardon me, €1 billion a day from their energy exports. So it'll be important to cut those off. But they are facing inflation. 800 companies plus have suspended operations, foreign companies in Russia. Planes are, airports are effectively, closed to their airspace. European and American airspace is closed to Russian planes. So, who can come in and out of the country is now very circumscribed. So this, is all bad for Russia. So I just finished a piece here for Journal of Democracy called "From Resurrection to Ruin," how Vladimir Putin is wrecking Russia as he attacks Ukraine.
The effects of the sanctions. I think the World Bank projection is this year the Russian economy will contract by 11%.
Yeah.
And the head of the Russian central bank said she expects it to contract by 8 to 10%.
Yeah, and that's the worst since 1998, 99.
Yeah.
So.
As Catherine was talking about regime, regime matters. She was saying, I was thinking of how leadership matters, and I was going to ask you, Ambassador, about the Ukrainian resistance, right? On that front, Zelensky's decision was critical, remaining in Kyiv and heading his, forces into battle against Russia, and that was, you said that the Ukrainians would have fought, and that's what, experts like yourself would have predicted that. But still, right, Zelensky's decision, it comes to, it struck me as a critical turning point in many ways that probably, I'm assuming, Russia didn't also calculate that way. They thought maybe, the leadership could leave Kiev. Could you expand upon that a little bit? And then I also wanted to discuss.
My guess that Zelensky's quality as a wartime leader was not predicted by the Kremlin. I don't think it was predicted by many Ukrainians. I don't think it was predicted by many in the West.
Most people thought he was going to leave, right?
No, and I mean, this is somebody who I think has kind of defined this as his, this is a former actor. He's defined this as the role of a lifetime. And that decision, I think, to remain in Kyiv, when you had both the United States and the British offering, we will help get you out so that you can get to Lviv or get someplace where you can set up a government exile, and the idea is I don't need a ride out of Kyiv, I need ammunition. I mean, that was, and I think he's really, and part of this are his skills as an actor. He knows how to play to his audience. So, every day he's giving a speech to a different audience, and I think he really knows how to target that audience, and you see it. And I think that just the image that kind of defined the leadership differences was, I think, about 10 days into the war, here's Zelensky, and he's, in his kind of brown khaki shirt with wearing his battle vest, out having tea with 3 or 4 Ukrainian soldiers who are manning a checkpoint, in central Kyiv. And then at the same day, you have the picture of Vladimir Putin meeting with his Minister of Defense and his Chief of the General Staff at this table 30 feet away, even though presumably these guys have been vaccinated, I would assume, to get to that close to the president. So it's just that difference in leadership styles. And then I think was a second image was when Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited Kyiv about 2.5 weeks ago. And they go out and they take a walk in the city. And I'm watching this. I go, oh, yeah, there's Institutskaya. They're walking down her. I mean, it's not like they're walking, just like within 100 yards or 100 meters of where they're meeting. They're some distance away. And he's out there walking. And then the thought occurred to my mind. I said, when was the last time anybody saw Vladimir Putin out walking around Moscow? So I think you've seen Zelensky really emerge as a wartime leader. And I think that has helped rally people who were prepared to be rallied.
Catherine, sort of managing the international public opinion through information, disinformation, misinformation campaigns, that was supposed to be one of strengths for Russia. And, we've seen that largely failing. Of course, there's a question whether that failed domestically. There's a question,
that succeeded domestically.
Yeah, in the UN, not everybody voted against Russia. The West did, but multiple, India and others. So
China.
in terms of number of countries, it was higher. So how do you see that? How did Russia play that when you contrast it with Zelensky's role, like Ambassador described?
Yeah, so you don't have to. I mean, Zelensky is. First of all, there's who needs what, right? So Ukraine needs to keep the Ukrainian leadership needs to keep attention on the conflict, and so Zelensky is obviously the man for this moment because he's very effective on social media. He does a nightly message on Telegram channel, and I assume on other channels. They're very active on Twitter and whatnot because they must have international support, right? They must, and they must keep it in the news because they won't survive without Western support. Russia doesn't have to win a popularity contest in the West, and they're not going to. And so there's no point in trying. They're not trying, but they are. The point in my book is that they had been subversive politically, especially in the European Union, trying to sort of break up the union of the unity of the European Union. And so the lingering effect of that is, yes, Germany is going to try to get off its incredible dependence. 40% of its energy comes from Russia. It will take time to do it, but they didn't jump to it right away. And because that would do tremendous damage to the German economy, obviously, if natural gas is cut off, that is in particular, which is hard to quickly and easily get from somewhere else because it's harder to move, then that's hard on the German economy, and that will ripple through the global economy. So I think the earlier strategy of building these relationships and trying to be disruptive within the European Union has actually worked well at this point for Russia. I'm sure it was a surprise and again a misread of how all of this worked on Putin's part and perhaps bad intelligence on the Social Democratic Party. But from Marine Le Pen has never, the far right candidate in France has never been closer to winning the presidency than she was 2 weeks ago. She got money from Russia, right? She in 2017 she was busily visiting Vladimir Putin and getting 7 million euros from a Russian bank to run her campaign. So I don't think that we have evidence that that hasn't paid off. The other thing is, you mentioned not everyone voted to condemn Russia in the Security Council. Well, the not everyone is the two countries with the biggest global populations. One is India, and one is China, and they most certainly did not vote. And the UN and Russia will, and neither will, I will predict, because of the ties that Russia has built with both economically, in particular, in not just the energy field, but in particular there. And so, they're not aiming their propaganda at us here in the West, but I can't help but notice that Tucker Carlson at Fox News is the star also of Russian news because he carries their message just fine. So they were very, very effective, Kadir, with that. Putin is not going to be doing a nightly Twitter or Telegram message. That's just, he's almost 70 years old. That's not him. Zelensky is a 44-year-old guy who has to keep the global attention on this. Putin doesn't probably want global attention on this. So I actually don't think the strategy has failed. Everything has led to this moment.
Yeah.
Who Putin cares about in terms of opinion, he's not running for world president, is his own society. And what they've done is essentially cut, and this is why I just wrote this article on how he's wrecked Russia as well. 30 years of reform has been undone over the last, I would say, 6 years in particular, but the last 8 weeks. Russians can no longer use Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. They can still access YouTube, but they YouTube channels of the opposition can't take payments anymore from within Russia because of our sanctions for their channels. He has jailed any opposition who would organize people on the streets. He has complete control now over state media. And so Russia has been taken back to about 1984 in terms of freedom of speech. So obviously that's fear for an autocrat. That's not confidence. That's fear. If they find out the truth, Russians will rise up.
On China and India, it's been interesting to me. I mean, I think China has done everything rhetorically it can to be supportive of Russia. And so they've not voted against Russia in the UN. They've not criticized Russia. But what Russia is doing here is it has to make some in Beijing very uncomfortable. The idea that you would take Crimea away from Russia, which the Chinese have never recognized as Russian territory, and then the declaration of the two so-called People's Republic and Donbass as independent states, that's anathema to the Chinese because that really undercuts their position with regards to Taiwan. But while I think the Chinese will rhetorically not challenge the Russians, I don't think you're going to see the Chinese moving to help the Russians out in sanctions. And this goes back to 2014, where after you had the first Western financial sanctions that cut Russian banks off from Western credit, there were efforts by Russian banks to get credit from China, and the Chinese really didn't help out. And I think in part was they didn't see Russia a particularly good investment, but there was a concern in China that they did not want to get crosswise with the sanctions and then become targets of secondary sanctions. And my guess is that there have been some quiet hints passed by Washington to Beijing that you don't want to get into secondary sanctions, because for China, their two biggest markets are still the European Union and the United States. On India,
So we have a slight disagreement.
okay.
Finally.
Oh no.
No,
Okay.
no, it's not. It's not very big, but keep guys. Sorry to interrupt. I would just say that so things have changed in the last 8 years with China and Russia in terms of interdependence. So China has a coal shortage. Who's got coal? Russia. China has to keep its economy going and has an almost infinite need for energy. So Russia has done a pivot to the east with energy supplies. China can I think what's going to happen, Steve, is that they're not necessarily going to give Russian banks loans, but they're not going to sanction Russian energy, oil and gas, and coal, and they're not going to cancel contracts for uranium plants. And so that's giving the Russian economy revenue. We are doing all of those things, right? And so that's where the sanctions are leaky, and China's not going to be helping us, or Ukraine, but they're not doing anything overtly new to help Russia either. So there, I agree with you, but they're also not really helping the Ukrainian cause particularly.
But I think there are some limits though. One is again, as Europe reduces its consumption of Russian natural gas, and that's going to take some time.
Yeah, probably 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. The Russians are going to have to be real fast at building LNG facilities or a 2,000 kilometer pipeline, because that gas that now goes to Europe, there's no infrastructure to move towards China. And on the oil question, I mean, this is one that could impact both both China and India. Is the one sanction that I think really is crying out there now is for Western insurance companies. I'm thinking here particularly Lloyd's of London, deny insurance for Russian flagships or ships carrying Russian cargoes, particularly oil, because if those ships can't get sanctioned, all of a sudden the risk factor becomes huge. I mean, if you lose an oil tanker full of oil, you're losing hundreds of millions of dollars potentially. And if you don't have insurance for that, that's going to make it, I think, much more difficult for the Indians and the Chinese to pick up the slack. And so I think that's the one big thing that could be done now by the West that could close off at least part of the ability of other countries to take up some of the slack from Western energy demand for Russian products going down.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I would just say, I think that's right. I mean, and in the piece I told you about on how Putin has wrecked Russia, the consumption from China on natural gas can't make up for what's being lost or will be lost, hasn't been lost yet to Europe. The European market will be gone forever once they have a different supplier and set up LNG terminals, liquefied natural gas terminals in Germany. That said, in the past 8 years, Russia hasn't been sitting on its hands anticipating this possibility. And they have built a new type pipeline, 2,000 kilometers to China called Power of Siberia. So, there is a way of increasing the capacity of that pipeline. And then one of the things that China and Russia have been working on together and China is interested in with Russia is actually they were increasing their level of foreign investment in Russia before the war, and they were increasing their consumption of Russian energy so that it's now up to 15% of Chinese energy comes from Russia. The the sort of northern trade route through the Arctic that is being caused by climate change is another thing that's attractive to China. And so conceivably, you could use some of the liquefied natural gas terminals that already exist in Russia to move natural gas over to China that route. And so that's what they're looking for. They could increase capacity that way. So, I wish we had more leverage on China to get them to cut off that market to Russia, but we don't right now. So will they do a lot of new things with Russia at the moment? Probably not, but they're not going to stop what they're already doing.
This kind of support by China and others, though, I feel like that would help sustain the Russian economy, perhaps make it more manageable. But
Yep.
the route to, I guess, global influence, that kind of good old days, I guess, for Russia would still require a major, continued major purchases by the Europeans on the energy market, which leads me to think that, at some point, even phasing out oil is going to be accomplished theoretically by the end of the year, not sooner. And then natural gas, Europe is not really willing to touch that right now. So I feel like Putin at some point might want to make a maneuver to prevent, that kind of energy sales from being completely, stopped. But
Hmm.
so, given that, do you think along the way, like Europe might say, okay, well, we've cut quite a bit, but we can continue to buy some, and then that would allow Russia to retain some of that,
Hmm.
trade.
Yeah. So, I mean, the strength of Europe is in its unity. And so Hungary, where Russia has been under Putin, and let's distinguish between Russia and Putin, but under Putin, he has been building very close ties with the Hungarians and the Serbs in particular. You have populist right-wing governments there. Mr. Orban is, in some ways has used Putinism as a model. And so he's dragging his heels about, cutting off Russian gas. But I think here, again, this is a terrible miscalculation on Mr. Putin's part, right? He did not expect that there would be European unity on this question of oil. And there appears to be, although we're seeing shakiness with Hungary in particular, and Mr. Orban just won re-election. So again, I think unanticipated on his part, but let me just caution. I did say earlier, time's not on his side, and he's, of all things, he's not stupid. So he may be aware of that, and that natural gas has not been cut off yet. So, once it's gone forever. And I bet he's doubting that it'll get cut off, just as you said, Kadir, to zero. But and he might be right on that. We don't know yet. Just because there's been a declaration or an intention, we have not seen that implemented, and it'll take time, as Steve mentioned.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah.
Ambassador, I want to turn to NATO, unless you wanted to add something. But Sweden's membership, Finland's membership, this is a serious talk now. Stoltenberg just made some remarks about that, and I wanted to ask you about the future of NATO. As promised at the beginning, I was going to make some comments about Turkey's position, maybe very quickly, if you allow me for a minute. Turkey has, good relations with both Ukraine and Russia, especially on the economic front. Turkey is highly energy dependent, similar to Germany in some ways. But Turkey has also sources from other places, Iraq, Libya, Iran. And then Turkey also relies on Russian and Ukrainian tourists, which this summer is going to be difficult. And Turkey wanted to lead the diplomatic efforts. Still, a NATO country supports Ukraine, has given drones and other material support to Ukraine. At the same time, trying to find a quick resolution, which, both sides, as you've described, they're not yet there yet, probably. But so what does this tell you about the future of NATO? One of the questions we got from the audience was, are we going to go back to a real Cold War environment that would last a long time? How do you see that future, given the broad unity that has been sustained so far, and that unity is even increasing if you include now, Germany's changing posture, Finland, Sweden joining NATO, etc.
Yeah. No, I think one of the many miscalculations that Mr. Putin and the Kremlin made was in their underestimation of the impact that this invasion would have on Western unity. So I think looking at the United States and Europe, late last year, you saw, we're very divided here in America. You're going to have a new chancellor in Germany at the beginning of 2022. The French president has his election. Boris Johnson's in trouble. There's a lot of transatlantic divisions lingering from the Trump presidency. And I think, Putin came up with the perfect way to sort of galvanize NATO, really restore US-EU relations. It was it was pretty remarkable how that turned out. And so you have seen some things. I mean, you now have, I think, NATO much more serious. Once the invasion began, you saw deployments that were going into the eastern flank that were on a bilateral basis, all of a sudden became part of the NATO response force. It was a NATO deployment. I think there's muscle memory in NATO. NATO knows what it needs to do. You have now, I think, most countries are on track to meet the 2% objective for amount of GDP spent on defense by 2024. That turnaround in Germany has been remarkable. I mean, Chancellor Scholz is basically, and remember, Germany at this point, I think was about 1.5% of its GDP on defense, which was a significant increase from, say, 2013, when it was only about 1%. I mean, there's a lot of extra money there. But Germany, if the projection until 2-3 months ago was Germany was not going to hit 2% until 2030. Well, Chancellor Scholz said, we're going to approve 100 billion euros. That's $110 billion now. That's the equivalent of that's twice what Germany spent on defense in 2021. So Germany will hit the 2% this year and exceed it. And that's going to buy, I mean, if the Germans get the procurement right, that's going to buy a lot of capability. I mean, when Lithuania hits 2%, that's good, but when, a country the size of
big
Germany,
economy,
that's big. And that's part of what you saw. I mean, that was sort of, the last of an element where in sort of 5 days, Berlin really swept away 5 decades of policy towards Russia. And that was a result of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And then you have Sweden and Finland, who I think have made the calculation that they can't be confident about Russian intentions. And now is the time where their security interests would be served by membership in NATO. These are 2 countries that check all the boxes: established democracies, civilian control of the military and the security services, real capabilities. I mean, it dramatically, I think, will change the defense position in the Baltics if you have Finland and Sweden there. And the Baltic region becomes much more defensible. So, I think NATO is going to emerge as a much stronger institution. It will be restoring some of the capabilities that it was drawing down for the last 25 years, because I think there now is a real question. My own view is, I think, particularly after the experience of the last 10 weeks, Putin probably doesn't want to tangle with NATO.
Yeah, but that seems clear. Seems clear. Yeah.
But I think, having said that, I'm not sure.
See,
and again,
he is tangling with NATO now.
A lot of people 6 or 8 months ago would have said, Putin won't be stupid enough to launch a major invasion of Ukraine. So I think the kind of the confidence level that we had that we would not have a conflict with Russia is different now. And I think NATO will respond. So if NATO holds to that, it's going to be a revitalized organization. It'll be capable of defending Europe. And I think it also is, we're heading for a period of cool relations with Russia. I think in Washington, my sense is that however this war ends, you don't get back to a normal relation. I mean, the president has called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. And I mean, when you look at what's happened in Mariupol, the indiscriminate shelling and bombing, that's a war crime. You look at what happened in Bucha, those are atrocities, those are war crimes. Now, and unfortunately, they're so widespread that this is just kind of the way the Russian military operates. Vladimir Putin's just the guy at the top, and you've not seen one word out of the Kremlin saying, we're going to investigate that. There was, remember, about 5 weeks ago, there was this report of Ukrainians taking Russian prisoners, and they shot 3 of them in the leg after they took them prisoner. And the first thing that the president's administration is, we're going to investigate that. The Russians sort of just deny it. And
that's accountable government versus authoritarianism.
Yeah, exactly.
Right there.
And so I just have a really hard time seeing, and I personally regret this, having spent probably half of my career in the Foreign Service trying to work on improving relations between Washington and Moscow. But I think it's going to be a long time to recover from this.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Stoner, I want to give you the last word. So you actually at the beginning talked about how this started in 2014. If you take the long view, this is only a another stage, miscalculated, botched effort, etc. But you also pointed out, Moldova matter. So what would be sort of Russian endgame, if you can call it that way? What would be their ideal solution for ideal scenario for now? Like, capture Donbass, and then that won't stay there. I feel like it will continue to Moldova. It will, this region, once Ukraine is completely cut off from Black Sea, that would be probably, ideal scenario for Russia. It won't stay there. It feels like. What is your assessment on that?
Well, that's I think you're probably right there. So it could be that we get into, as we did in 2014, some kind of Minsk-like agreement that is again not well enforced. After, especially, the Russians have done, as you're saying, effectively cut Ukraine off from the Azov Sea and the Black Sea. If they take Odessa, for example, and if they were to come in from Transnistria, as I showed you, and into Ukraine that way. So that might be the goal right now, and then negotiate some kind of quote unquote ceasefire or agreement. It's pretty unlikely, I think, the Ukrainians are going to be okay with that, especially given, the war crimes that have happened. I think they may not want to negotiate until the Russians withdraw completely, and I don't think that'll happen. So this is going to go on a while, and even if there is some sort of ceasefire after Russia, Mr. Putin feels and it is him and his entourage, his group, feel that they've gone as far as they can go, then you're right. There is the real possibility that they will just pause and then try it again in a few more years. And so I think that, we've now had this experience, as has Ukraine, and we won't sit quietly and allow that to happen. And so just getting back to Steve's earlier comment that, our own Secretary of Defense has said now the goal is to weaken Russia, so this never happens again or doesn't happen again soon. So our strategy has shifted, even as theirs has, and so they won't achieve even the goal of I think cutting off from the Black Sea and then expecting we'll all accept that and rearming and coming back. Hopefully that is not what will happen.
Thank you, Dr. Stoner. If nobody else has any additional comments, I'm going to close this session here. I want to thank you both for such thoughtful and detailed comments and information. This has been a great session. So thank you, Ambassador Pifer, and thank you, Dr. Stoner. I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve. Always a pleasure.
Yes, even when we disagree.
Let's go grab coffee. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you both.
Bye now.
Bye.
Our audience. Bye-bye.